You're listening to the Arts in Isolation podcast, brought to you by Asia House.
Hello, this is Juan de Lara, Cultural Manager at Asia House, and today we have a very exciting and amusing topic, and I would say that very important for many of you in the morning, the story of coffee. So much has been written and said about coffee, where it came from, who first consumed it, what was it used for. So in order to untangle this mashup of stories and narratives, we have with us today Seif Rashidi, Director of the Baraka Trust, our partner organization, and Nancy Am, Professor of Art History at Binghamton University in New York. Nancy's books and research have mostly focused in the history of trade of the city of Mocha in Yemen and its relation to architecture and material culture, and particularly documenting one of the largest communities in the region, coffee. Her research explores the Islamic world from the perspective of the coast, with a focus on material, visual, and built culture on the Arabian Peninsula and around the rims of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. So, thanking you both for being here, and also to our supporters, the Altair Trust and the Al Trust for Culture. Welcome, Seif and Nancy.
So thank you, Nancy, very much for being with us on our podcast series. It's really a pleasure to have you with us. And you are a professor of art history. One of the things that you tell me is that when you tell your students to look up the history of coffee, they all come back with different responses and different results. So can you please tell us what the story of coffee is in a nutshell?
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much, Seif, for inviting me to have this conversation. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to talk a little bit more about my work and the history of coffee and the history of mocha. So one of the problems with the history of coffee is that, in my view, it's really three separate but interrelated histories. There's the history of the coffee plant or the coffee bush. There's the history of the drink coffee as the hot beverage that we are all familiar with. And there's the history of the coffee bean as a commodity. And so if we just start with the history of the plant, and I'm specifically speaking about coffee Arabica. There are other varietals of coffee, but of course coffee Arabica is the original coffee that was consumed and the one that concerns us. But that varietal of coffee has grown wild in the mountains of Ethiopia. And so that is the origin of the coffee plant. But when it comes to the coffee drink, it is believed that coffee was first consumed as a hot beverage, not in Ethiopia, but actually in Yemen, and probably somewhere along the Red Sea or Arabian Sea coastline in the lowlands of Yemen. And we also believe that the origins of this drink, the beverage coffee, likely date to the early 15th century. It was probably used first by Muslim mystics or Sufis, and it was used because its stimulating properties kept Sufis alert and awake during their spiritual exercises, which were usually conducted at night. I should also add, though, that in terms of the history of the coffee bean, Yemen was also the first place where coffee was cultivated widely as an export crop. And in fact, Yemen held a quasi-monopoly on the coffee bean until the early decades of the 18th century. And it is after that point when the coffee plant was transported to other parts of the world, to the other parts of the Indian Ocean and to the Atlantic, and then eventually cultivated successfully. And this led to the globalization of both the coffee plant and the coffee bean, which is, of course, the situation that we are in today that we are all familiar with. So when I tell the story of coffee, I like to cut it up into these three different stories, which are, of course, interrelated, but they all have their own particular inflections and are slightly different, and I think need to be told separately.
So you told me that there were many myths related to coffee and its origins. Can you tell us what are some of the most popular myths which your research dispels?
Sure. So there are many myths about coffee and also many regional myths about coffee, but I will share with you, I think, two of the most widespread ones that are also relevant to the work that I do. The one that I think many have heard is about Kaldi, the goat herder. And the story goes that Kaldi sent his goats out to graze as he normally would do. And then one day, they came back and they were particularly active and frisky. So according to the story, this kept on happening, and so Khaldi decided to figure out what was going on. So he followed the goats to see what they were eating, and he noted that they were actually munching on the cherries, the red cherries of a plant that he was not familiar with. So he decided to try these cherries himself, and after he ate one of these cherries, he felt very much invigorated. And so the story goes that this was the discovery of the coffee plant, and that Khaldi and his goats were the ones who were able to locate the coffee plant and to be the first ones to find out about its stimulating qualities. And it's obviously a fanciful story. It's not really grounded in history. Sometimes people tell the story as locating it in Ethiopia, sometimes in Yemen, but that's the one that I think is the most widespread. The second myth that is grounded a bit more historically takes place definitely in Yemen and in the port of Mocha, which is the focus of my research and that I think we'll be hearing more about in today's discussion. And it is both the story of coffee and the story of the rise of that port city. And in this story, we hear that there was a ship that was sailing from India into the Red Sea. And one of the sailors on board that ship fell very ill. And so the crew decided to dock the boat at the first port that they came across in the Red Sea, and that happened to be Mocha. And that Mocha at this time was not yet a big international port as it would become in later centuries. And as this story goes, the crew came across a man in that port who was referred to as a sheikh named Shadali, who was also a touted Sufi teacher who had a wide following. And he gave that ill sailor a hot drink. And after the sailor drank this drink, he immediately felt revived and cured. And of course, that drink was coffee. And it was said that this was really the beginning of the rise of the port. At this time, that Sheikh Shadali made the premonition that Mocha would rise up as a major port. And you can see that this particular story, which is connected to actually a historical figure, Shadali, very much kind of ties together many strands of that city's history, because indeed his own legacy and the legacy of Mocha have all become quite associated with coffee. And in many ways, I see this as one of those kinds of urban legends that's composed to make sense of a city's history that is often kind of pulled together after the rise of that city. And so those are two of the myths about coffee that I think really kind of ground us in its early history as well.
Thank you. So your research and what you're talking about takes us to Yemen, to Mocha specifically, and also to the figure of Sheikh Shazli. Can you tell us something about this figure and what do we know about him and whether he actually had a role to play in the spread or the patronage of coffee?
Sure. And so unlike Khaldi, the goat herder, Shadli is a historic figure. We know that he was born in Yemen near the city of Zabid sometime in the late 14th century. He then traveled around the Red Sea, visiting Mecca, traveling to Jerusalem and to Cairo. And it was in Egypt where he was initiated into the Shadiliya Sufi order. He then spent time on the African coast of the Red Sea before returning to Yemen. And then he decided to settle in the port city of Mocha. And this was in the early 15th century. As I described, that port was not a major city at that time. He in fact died there and was buried in the city of Mocha, and he is the patron saint of that city as well. And I will tell you that he is frequently identified as the world's first drinker of coffee. As a historian, though, I will say that there are some problems in terms of that identification, in that when we look at the biographical records of this figure, there's no mention of coffee until about 100 years after he died. And so the connection between him and coffee was most definitely posthumous. And we can say, though, I think with much more certainty that it was around that time in the early 15th century, somewhere perhaps in or around Mocha or one of the port cities that are adjacent to it, that coffee began to be consumed. But this kind of direct association between Shadili and the drinking of coffee is one that I think has been developed over time. And so it can be also cast as another one of these coffee myths that we often hear repeated popularly.
But it's interesting that you say that its first use comes from religious practices of Sufis, because I suppose it's a stimulant. How did people react to that? I mean, were there reactions against the use of coffee when it was first discovered in the 15th century?
Yes, absolutely. And so I should say that although coffee first, or coffee drinking and coffee consumption, we believe first began in Sufi circles, as coffee then began to move and spread outside of Yemen, it also spread outside of the Sufi context and definitely came into more general use. And we know that certainly by the late 15th century and definitely the early 16th century, that coffee was moved through the Red Sea. We hear in the year 1511 about the consumption of coffee in the city of Mecca, for instance, and then in other cities like Cairo, Damascus, and Istanbul. And wherever coffee spread during this time, it ignited some kinds of controversy. And there are two aspects to this controversy. One had to deal with the substance itself and its effect on the body. Clearly, as I think we all recognize, coffee has a pharmacological effect on the body because of the caffeine that it conveys. And early on in the Islamic world, coffee was very much connected and associated with wine, and it was seen because of its effect on the body. And it was seen as equally deleterious and dangerous, although I will say that there were debates about how coffee actually affected the body. It was a new substance, and there were a lot of questions about it. But then there was also the social aspect of coffee. As we know, coffee is very much a social beverage. And even as coffee began to spread throughout the Islamic world, and particularly through the Ottoman lands, it very much brought people together. And in this way, coffee was also seen as quite dangerous socially. And authorities of the cities that I just mentioned, like Cairo and Istanbul, saw that coffee had the potential to bring people together and possibly even bring about some subversive effects, and to allow for individuals to kind of come together in ways that they may not necessarily sanction. And so the result was that coffee was banned in most of the cities that it emerged in. And we have a pretty good historical record of the edicts against coffee, particularly in the early 16th century. But as we all know, coffee is a very alluring substance. And so coffee drinkers basically did not heed these bans. And we know that edict after edict was issued. And when you see an edict issued over and over again, it tells you certainly that no one is listening to it. But by the end of the 16th century, it became very clear that coffee was here to stay, and that it was not worth fighting against. And so it has a very kind of rocky history in those first centuries when it was introduced, and when it really was not understood. And of course, anything that is new, was kind of seen as this dangerous thing. And so coffee definitely fell into that category. It was certainly a polarizing drink in its early centuries.
And how did it spread from the city of Mocha to become this international phenomenon? It's quite remarkable.
Yeah, and so again, I would tell that story of the spread probably again along those three different vectors that I described. So the drink, as I just mentioned, moved from Yemen all the way up the Red Sea and into the Mediterranean. And from the Mediterranean, particularly those parts of Europe that were adjacent to Ottoman lands, were the first places in which coffee was experienced. And so we see then coffee spreading through Europe through the geographical vector of the Mediterranean. But when we talk about the spread of the coffee plant, that took a little bit of a different route, because that was more of an Indian Ocean story. And we know that the coffee plant was transferred to India sometime in the 16th century. And then in the 17th century, coffee was brought by the Dutch to the island of Java, which was really the first large-scale cultivation of coffee outside of the southern Red Sea area. And from there, then coffee was brought to the Atlantic and other parts of the Indian Ocean, and we see its global cultivation that I already mentioned. And indeed, the coffee bean did not necessarily always move through the Mediterranean. Sometimes it was shipped through the Mediterranean, and sometimes it was shipped to the south through Indian Ocean channels. So we can understand that each one of those different kind of let's say, characters of coffee or aspects of coffee, the drink, the plant, and the bean, moved in slightly different ways, although, of course, they intersected. But I will say that by the end of the 17th century, coffee houses could be found in every major city of Europe. And so by that point, we reached a point of no return, and coffee was poised to become the global drink that we are familiar with today.
And were these coffee houses a new form of establishment or new form of premises, or had they existed serving other things before?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a large literature, and I would probably refer you to colleagues who have written about the coffee house extensively in the context of the Middle East as well as in the context of Europe. And we know that the rise of the coffee house in both of these various spaces brought about new types of sociability, new types of interaction, and new types of public engagement. And so it was, very much the kind of introduction of so many kinds of interactions that we associate with modern life, certainly.
And were these originally spaces in which men interacted, or were they always for men and women?
Yeah, so I mean, coffee's early history, as I already described, was very much oriented around the communal practices of Sufis, a very male-oriented space. And as it spread in the public sphere throughout the Islamic world, we can really understand the story told through, male-dominated social public spaces. But it's also clear, though, that along with these kind of external activities, there was a rise of domestic practices associated with coffee. And so, for instance, some scholars have done some really great work looking at like the items that you might find in a household, for instance, in the city of Damascus in the early 18th century. And in that household, you will find a huge range of coffee implements, coffee cups, coffee pots, and coffee preparation tools, which gives us a sense that people were also drinking coffee in the home, and that this would have certainly involved other members of the family, women and men. But those external spaces of sociability, certainly in the Middle East, would have been very much male dominated.
And do you think that in Europe they would have been male dominated as well?
Yes, early on, they definitely were male dominated. And there was, again, in Europe as well, a kind of domestic sphere of coffee consumption that developed that also, as I described for the Middle East, entailed a whole range of accoutrements and items and a whole visual culture. I would say that it is not an accident that the rise of hot drinks like coffee, like tea, like chocolate as well, really in the 16th century, which was also a time when we know that porcelain, mainly from China, very much rose up as a domestic product, right? And so you have these items that become very important to households along with these hot drinks that were very well suited to consumption in them. So there's a lot of stories that you can tell about the cultures of coffee that entail other items outside of coffee itself. And we're all linked into a rising world in which products were circulating in a way that they had not in the century before. So it's a kind of exciting moment in terms of consumption, and coffee was kind of one part of this larger system.
And going back to Mocha, which is, as I understand from you, the center of it all, what was Mocha like as a place in the 16th century?
Yeah, so Mocha in the 16th and I would say really 17th and 18th centuries was very much a cosmopolitan port. There were merchants who came from other parts of the Islamic and Ottoman worlds, I would say, depending on what period you're talking about. There was a large contingent of traders that were from different parts of the Arabian Peninsula, as well as the adjacent bodies of water on both sides of it, so the Red Sea and the Gulf. And the port of Mocha was also very much run by merchants who came from India, particularly from the province of Gujarat, from the port of Surat was a major site that was connected to the city of Mocha. And these Indian merchants played a huge role in the trade. In the early 17th century, we see the rise and the arrival of Europeans, with the English and the Dutch primarily, but also other groups such as the French and the Swedish, and eventually the Americans, who all arrive in Mocha with a desire to get involved with the trade, which included coffee, but also included other items as well that came from the Indian Ocean, such as Indian textiles were really important, bulk metals were very important, aromatics as well as spices also moved through that city. And so it was a really multidimensional trade, of which coffee was indeed probably what Mocha is most famous for, but it was only one of the commodities that moved through that port.
And did the architecture, did the physical look of the city reflect this cosmopolitan nature of it?
Yeah, and so, it was actually through the architecture of Mocha that I first got interested in the city. And my doctoral dissertation, written now a long time ago, was about the architecture and the urban form of that city. And so what was really fascinating to me is that the buildings in Mocha are very different than, say, buildings that you find in the interior of Yemen. And I should just add that Yemen has this amazing tradition of vernacular building. And so when you go from village to village, they're often relying upon local building materials, local stone, local wood, as well as techniques that are very much kind of crafted for that locality. But then when you go to the coasts of Yemen, to not only the port of Mocha, but also related ports like El Hodeida to the north of Mocha, El Luheya as well to the north of El Hodeida, you see a very different architecture, and one that is connected to other ports of the Red Sea. In fact, it's often referred to by the name the Red Sea style. And these houses, which are tall and whitewashed and often adorned with wooden carved windows that project, as well as wooden carved doors, carved from wood that may have come all the way from Southeast or South Asia. These buildings are quite distinctive, but they are tied together with the kinds of houses and buildings that you might see in a port like Jeddah or Yanbo in modern day Saudi Arabia, or Sawakin in Sudan across the Red Sea, as well as Massawa in modern day Eritrea. And so it's a really interesting example of a style that is tied together by a body of water rather than by land-based ties. And I will say that if, say, you were a traveler who was coming from all the way from India, or perhaps from the Gulf, like a city like Muscat, for instance, when you would arrive in the port of Mocha, there were some elements of this architecture that I believe would have been very familiar to the new arrival, to make that person feel perhaps a little bit more at home, the nature of the woodwork, the nature of the kind of carving in lime on the surface. All of this would have been familiar to kind of form this cosmopolitan aesthetic of exchange around the Indian Ocean. And so that's been a topic of great interest for me in my research.
And you also mentioned people coming from England and other places in Europe, the Dutch, the Americans further afield. Did they bring ideas, or, I mean, how did you trade with coffee merchants in Mocha? Was it through goods?
Yeah, no, this is a really a great question, I would say. So, and one of the kind of historical, I would say, problems with studying the Indian Ocean trade is that we have a large number of documents that were left by those European merchants. So, for instance, in my research, I spent a great deal of time working with the records of the English East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. And those particular records tell us a great deal about trade in Mocha, much more so than local sources in Arabic do. And so we understand, though, that if we're going to rely on those documents, they're only going to tell us one side of the story, definitely the side of the story of those traders who have come from afar, who quite frankly didn't always understand everything that they encountered or witnessed in that port. And so, we always have to be very careful about the way that we use that documentation. And they describe the trade with great detail, often providing, for instance, minute information about the price of coffee, for instance, which fluctuated, it would go up and down. And the fact, for instance, that you could only buy coffee with silver, and the main currency that was used were Spanish reals of 8 in Mocha for coffee, as well as in the coffee market, which is a place called, located in a place called Beit al-Faqih, which was located a few days away from Mocha, which is where most of the coffee transactions in Yemen took place. And that most of the coffee transactions were handled by a group of Indian brokers that were referred to and called the Banians. And this group really served as the intermediaries for all merchants in the lowlands of Yemen, including the Europeans. And so when the Europeans arrived in the city of Mocha and to trade at Beit al-Faqih, they were part of a system that was already very much formed. They were just participants in it. They did not drive that trade. They were often purchasing much smaller quantities than, for instance, the merchants who came from Jeddah, who were shipping for the largest market for coffee in the Mediterranean, which of course was Cairo. So when we talk about the Europeans and their activities in Yemen, it's important to understand that they were really important as observers for us, but that they were never dominant. And their records, in fact, give us a sense that they often struggled to make sense of local systems of trade. They made a lot of mistakes. They often felt like they were being, kind of duped or double-crossed, and they also misunderstood a lot of what was going on around them. So we're, as historians, in this kind of difficult position of trying to balance and work with the documentation that's left by them. But they are really useful because those documents tell us a lot about some of the just real basic details of the trade that are difficult to glean from local sources.
And thinking about all the different types of coffee around the world today, I mean, the question that comes to my mind is, what kind of coffee did they drink in Yemen?
In Yemen, we know that in the early centuries of coffee, the kind of black brewed coffee from the roasted bean that we are familiar with was consumed. But there was also another kind of coffee that is called kishur, and it's made from the husk of the coffee bean. And that kishur or husk is something that most people, when they produce coffee today, just discard. And in Yemen, that husk, which was often a waste product of the trade, actually is also roasted and then ground and brewed for a drink that is called also kishur. And we know that historically, this beverage, which is a lot lighter than coffee that's brewed from the bean, and might be closer to tea in terms of its flavor, but is also caffeinated, that is consumed much more widely than coffee that's brewed from the black bean. And also that particular substance was consumed. We have records going back into the 17th century, but definitely by the 18th century, when people would arrive, for instance, in the port of Mocha, and they would be given a cup of coffee, it was always kishur. And I will say that some of my observers of that phenomenon did not like kishur very much at all. They did not think that it tasted good, but it really gives us a sense that there was a very different tradition of drinking coffee that developed in this homeland of coffee consumption. And so that's a kind of distinct feature of Yemen's coffee culture that I think comes from its place in the coffee trade. And I surmise, although I don't have real documentation for this, but I do kind of just propose as an idea that Yemeni merchants really realized that they would do better by shipping the precious bean out to other parts of the world, and that they would make do by drinking from this waste product again, rather than discarding it, instead of brewing coffee from the precious bean at home. But again, that is something that is just a hunch on my part.
That they exported the desirable stuff and came up with a drink that made use of a component that not many people wanted.
Precisely. And I will say that we do have evidence, though, that the husk, the gish, was also exported very early on. There are some documents that have actually been found in the Sinai that indicate that both the bean or bun and the kishur or husk were exported early on, but that ended. And then it was, I guess that there was not very much demand for the husk outside of Yemen. And then after I would say the 16th century, we no longer see any export of that husk, and it's entirely the bean that is the major export product, even though, again, as I've already described, the husk would be consumed as a drink in Yemen. And I should also add that when one drinks kishur, it often includes a lot of sugar and spices like cardamom and ginger as well. So it's a very kind of spice beverage, again, that tastes probably somewhere in the middle between coffee and tea.
And what is Mocha like today? Is coffee production still an important part of its economy or of Yemeni economy?
Yeah, so I'll answer that question in two parts. The first thing I will say is that, after coffee became very much a global product, Yemen's stake in that trade definitely declined. And unfortunately, the coffee production industry in Yemen also declined. But in recent years, there has been a lot of efforts that have been conducted by both international and local entrepreneurs who have tried to revive the coffee cultivation industry in Yemen. And so I will say that there's a great deal of pride right now in developing coffee and growing coffee again in Yemen, and claiming that historic place as really the site of large-scale coffee cultivation. And so those efforts are ongoing, although, as I'm sure you and listeners to this podcast will know, there is a very devastating war that has been going on in Yemen for 5 years. And so that's, of course, made all of these kinds of initiatives difficult. But that is definitely something that is part of a larger plan for social and economic development in Yemen. But in terms of the port of Mocha, I will say, two things happened in the 19th century that really affected the future of Mocha. One was that the British came to control Aden in the 19th century, and Aden is, of course, a port that is very famous as well in Yemen. It has a longer history than Mocha, but after Mocha began to rise up and was really kind of propelled forward by the Ottomans, Aden declined a great deal. And then in the 19th century, though, when the British took control of Aden and used it as a way station in the Indian Ocean, it then began to surpass Mocha in terms of its prominence. A lot of Mocha's trade moved to that port. Additionally, the Ottomans returned for a second period of control in Yemen in the 19th century. And rather than bolstering Mocha, which they were originally responsible for building up in the 16th century during the first period of control of that region, they decided to install themselves in another port, which is the port of Al-Hodeida, that's located to the north of Mocha. And so in the 19th century, Mocha's trade very much lost out to these two rival ports, one to the north and one to the south. And at that time, a lot of the merchants left. And so the port city then began to fall into a period of extended decline, unfortunately. So if you were to visit Mocha today, you would see a city that was does not really represent its height of trade. A lot of the old merchant houses that I've already told you about have fallen into decline. And unfortunately, Mocha has been on the front lines of the current conflict. And so many parts of that city were destroyed or greatly damaged by airstrikes. And I will tell you one of the saddest things about the conflict is that the tomb of our Sheikh Shadili, who is again the putative first drinker of coffee, his tomb was destroyed, we believe sometime in the year 2017. The causes of that destruction are not entirely clear, but it was a very big loss for that port because, of course, that was the oldest structure in the city, and a structure that really was a monument to coffee. I should say, however, that there was a mosque also dedicated to that same sheikh that it was adjacent to the tomb, and that building is still standing, but the tomb is no longer intact, which is, again, a terrible historical loss for the city, as well as for us as architectural historians.
So South America, is it production of coffee there a much later thing?
Well, so we began to see the appearance of coffee in the early 18th century in the Atlantic as well, on the island of Martinique, which is one of, as another coffee myth goes, there is this one plant that is sent from the botanical gardens in Paris all the way to Martinique, and that plant was really the beginning of the Atlantic, Caribbean, and adjacent and associated South American cultivation of coffee. So it does also date from those early 18th century moments in which coffee was being planted in these different sites. So that, so it's all at the same time. Of course, now people associate coffee cultivation with South America sometimes before they will associate it with Yemen, right? But indeed, it is an inheritor of that tradition rather than a forerunner.
Well, thank you. That's been a really fascinating exploration of Mocha, the center of coffee trade as a drink. And it's also significant to know about the fact that, it's lasted for so long, but many bits of it have been destroyed in the past few years. And I hope that there's enough documentation and also enough interest that when things calm down, there might be investment into restoring and reconstructing and trying to bring back some of that legacy of this really important city to which so many of us are indebted today.
Yes, I think, we all just hope for peace in Yemen and for Yemenis. And I think that is, my first and foremost wish and hope and desire. And indeed, there's been a lot of interest in the destruction of heritage in Yemen, a lot of very dedicated heritage professionals on the ground who are trying to make sure that there's documentation of what has happened. And when this conflict is over, we hope that we can all return to the port of Mocha and hopefully re-envision some of this illustrious past.
Well, thank you. We hope so too. And we found over the years in our work that actually documentation is a really key part of preservation and reconstruction, restoration when it's possible. So we share your hope and your vision and for a peaceful Yemen.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It was fascinating.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. And it was so nice to meet you and speak with you, Seif. I really appreciate it.
In person soon.
That would be lovely. That would be lovely.
You were listening to the Arts in Isolation podcast, brought to you by Asia House. For more information, please visit our website, asiahousearts.org.